Well, I know, people will probably be joining us as we over the next few minutes, but I do want us to start promptly because we want to make sure we're, um, concerned about everybody's time. We are very fortunate to have with us today Dr. Tom Fagan, who is our presenter. But before we begin, I also want to make sure that I introduce Dr. Jean Cash, who directs our doctoral program in school psych here at Nova Southeastern University, Dr. Irina Kasi, who directs our specialist program here at Nova, and they are going to work with me to mind the question and answer box and any of the chats that come through so that we can ask Dr. Fagan questions. But we are delighted to have Dr. Thomas Fagan here, who's a distinguished figure in the field of school psych with a career that spans over 5 decades. He earned his PhD in school psych in 1969 from Kent State University, becoming its first PhD graduate in this discipline. He's held prominent academic and administrative positions, including serving as the director of school psych programs at Western Illinois University from 1969 to 1976, and then the University of Memphis from 1976 to 2021, where he also oversaw the PhD program until 2014. He has served twice as president of our National Association of School Psychologists and led state associations in Illinois and Tennessee. He contributed extensively as an editor and historian, documenting the evolution of school psych. And Irina and I had a lovely time earlier this morning getting a sneak preview of that history and the evolution of our specialty area. His publications, including School Psych, Past, Present, and Future, and the Historical Encyclopedia of School Psych, have established comprehensive historical narratives for our profession. Dr. Fagan's groundbreaking work earned him numerous honors, including NASP's Lifetime Achievement Award, the Willard R. Sparks Eminent Faculty Award from the University of Memphis, and the Nadine Murphy Lambert Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Psychological Association Division of School Psych, Division 16. His legacy includes the establishment of archival collections for NASP, the Tennessee Association of School Psychologists, and the International School Psych Association, recognized for his research, teaching, and historical contributions. Dr. Fagan remains a revered figure in the field, celebrated for his dedication to advancing school psychology on both the national and international levels. So we are so pleased and so grateful that you are spending a little bit of your time with us today. So I'm going to let you take it away.
Thanks, Sarah. That was very nice introduction. Let me mention that my wife and I have lived here in Memphis since we came here in 1976. Before that, we were at Western Illinois University in a little cornfield town, Macomb, Illinois, which when we would interview faculty there for positions, if they got off the plane and actually didn't get right back on and leave, we figured maybe there's a chance they'll come here to teach on the faculty. But some of these programs have had tough times recently. But we have 3 children. They're all adult children at, I think, probably 45, 47, 49. So it's hard to believe that you're living in an era when you no longer just know your parents, but your grandparents and other people that are around. So it's really changed the flavor of growing up in America in the last century for sure. I got interested in school psychology kind of inadvertently, as did many of the people I think that came into school psychology in the 1950s and 1960s, because there wasn't much else going on in training programs in that. They were growing up fast in Ohio. And in my junior year, I was approached by one of the persons in the school psychology program that were contacting all the undergraduates who were psychology minors and teaching majors, and mine was in social studies. And so I talked to them about it. And then when I went into the senior year, I switched over in graduate school into the school psychology program. And that was a fairly new program at Kent State. I stayed there until 1969 when I graduated as the first doctoral recipient in school psychology at Kent State University, and I still get back there periodically. And it was those were just great years, I thought. But what really got me interested in the history of school psychology was during the NASP presidency. Um, I traveled around a lot. I mean, maybe 110 days as president, you would travel. And in those days, they didn't pay the president of NASP anything. You got your university to agree to go along. Today, I think the president of the NASP, Gene, you can probably respond to this, gets money from NASP to replace the position while the president travels all over the country. And
Yeah,
I
that's
don't know what
correct.
that's up to, but probably it used to be up to about 110,000 a year was given to the university. I don't know how much it is now. I think President Guidobaldi in 1982 or 3 was probably the first person to get that kind of compensation. I was always on the wrong end of compensation. It seemed that we could propose it, but the money ended up going to the next person. But I would travel around, and I've been to about 45 state associations over the years, maybe even more. But I was always impressed with how little the audience at those meetings knew about school psychology nationally, and in many cases, even about the growth of school psychology in their state. And so I would often go to a state association meeting and take some statistical information about who they are and where they came from and some background history for them. They seem to really appreciate that. And so I started collecting stuff. And I was in on the ground floor of NASP in the late 1960s and early 70s. So I was able to get newsletters and things like that from them. NASP was a pretty small operation in those days. The first year their membership was under 1,000, then it kind of went up quite a bit. This is the first newsletter of the National Association of School Psychologists, and not much to it. I'm trying to think if there are any photos in here. No, photos were expensive. They didn't start those until a year or so later, but it would have state information in it and message from the president, budget information. The salary of the executive secretary was going to be $10,000. I don't think Susan Gorham would have ever worked for that kind of money in the DC area. But the whole budget was only about $35,000. Dues were $25, I think, in those days. I don't know what are they up to now? About $200 a year, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, for some members, yes,
And they have
but
an article in there on the
higher
National
for most.
Association was founded in St. Louis at this meeting in 1969 and where they were going to be in 1970. And that was their first state association newsletter. I think my collection now, which would fill a box up about that big, is all the issues of the newsletter, hard copies. So if you are looking at something and you're studying it and it has a reference to a NASP communique article in 1975. I've got it. Just drop me a line. I can probably find it. Whether or not I ever read it is a different matter. But nowadays, the communique is a newspaper. It's bigger than the local newspaper here in Memphis, I'm sure. But it makes a big difference. This would be the first newsletter of the Division of School Psychology for APA, and it is dated as I'm seeing it backwards. You're seeing it correctly, but it was August 1, 1947. So they were a pretty small operation too. In fact, when the division got started, there were the minutes of those meetings are really funny. Back at that time, there were people in the clinical division and in the APA generally calling to get rid of Division 16 for the first 6 or 8 years because their membership was so small. And most of their people were practitioners and they were more interested in research orientations of the other original 19 divisions. So that was a period in 1945 when all the divisions became formal. There's a lot more now. I wouldn't be surprised that there's 55 divisions now on every imaginable field of psychology. And their minutes in that are also quite extensive, and they have a pretty large newsletter periodical during the year of time. So that really got me interested in the history of the field. And the more I went back through it, I started thinking to myself, you know, what is it that really makes something unusual for school psychology? What's the most unusual event in it, or the most eventful event in the history of school psychology? And I'd be curious in what some of you would think. I used to ask my class that, then they would mention things like the concept of mental tests in the 1890s, the founding of the first psychological clinic by Whitmer in 1896, which closed, I think, many years ago. His journal closed out around the 1930s. The compulsory schooling movement certainly was, and immigration had a profound impact. But what I finally decided was that the main event in the whole history of school psychology for me was that somewhere along the line, when school psychology started growing enough to have people called school psychology and to be trained as school psychology, these people began to graduate from programs, all kinds of programs, all different titles. And as they graduated, where did they go for employment? Did they go into private practice? A little bit here, a little bit there. There wasn't a whole lot of therapy theories around. Carl Rogers and all the big gospel people, you know, of those days for the gospel of interventions. That was the 30s and 40s and that. No, they went into the schools to work. Most of them went into the schools. In fact, the concept of clinical psychology promoted by Leitner Whitmer was a one-on-one type of psychology. And if you wanted to be a member of Division 16, you had to be familiar with tests, and you had to be able to give those tests, and you worked with children and school children in particular. So that to me was significant because it entered into what I call the two worlds of school psychology, two worlds of psychology and school psychology. Psychology today is regulated by all kinds of things that go on in the field of education and professional education, from licensing all the way to accreditation to where your program is located. Most programs are in schools of education, not in arts and science departments or in psychology departments necessarily like yours here at the university. And the psychology side of the two worlds was being run by APA. Even back to 1892, when it was founded, it was a small operation and dues were a couple of bucks, but it grew fast. And eventually by 1945, it got all kinds of divisions for different things, including all the professional areas, including the Division 16 for school psychology. So if you think of school psychology history, look at what's going on in psychology and what's going on in the field of education. And almost everything that happens in a big way in one of those arenas will in some way have an impact on school psychology. People wonder, why the hell do you have to go to the State Department of Education to get a credential? You're a psychologist. Well, don't ask them, because for a long time they'd say, no, you're not really psychology, you're school psychology. And it took a long time for NASP, I think, to get the message out that no, we are psychology, we just work in schools, and there's nothing bad about that. But for a long time, school psychology had sort of a bad image. It wasn't research oriented enough. It worked with children, which was not a big deal in the first half of the 20th century. And most of its members were females, and that was a death knell for just about any specialty in psychology in those days. Nowadays, almost every aspect of the field of school psychology is regulated, managed, whatever, by women, and that's been a major change. In fact, I would say that if you looked at what is the big change in the field of school psychology in the past 60 or 70 years, it's the presence of females in every role of leadership. You could see this coming when they started writing articles for the journal, and then somebody actually appointed them as an assistant editor or associate editor. And today, most of those journals have had a full-time editor at one time in the last 10 or 15 years. that is a woman. And in training programs, you can see them coming. First, they're coming into the graduate programs. All of a sudden, you have the situation now where almost every graduate program in school psychology and in most areas of psychology, quite frankly, are dominated by female applicants and graduates of the program. And the faculty then moved on. People used to say, why aren't there more women on the faculty in the school psychology program? The answer was, well, they're just coming. They'll be here soon. And they sure as hell did show up. And it's been a big change in the whole field of school psychology. So the two worlds of school psychology, of the world of education and the world of psychology, really make a difference. Ask yourself why your training program is accredited by APA and by what used to be called NCATE. Now it's got a different name for accrediting education professionals, CAPE. So that's the two worlds. I wouldn't be surprised that at some point, school psychology has always been sort of an iffy area and had to keep its stability inside both camps at the same time. I remember when the State Department of Education here many years ago added a requirement that anybody getting an initial certificate from the State Department of Education had to have a course on exceptional children. They were finally getting around to realizing that, you know, most of what's there is exceptional children. That's what we do. Well, for school psychology, that was not a big problem. But it's just like some clinical psychology programs have to have a course or experience in hospital management, because that's where they're going to be. So you got to understand the setting you're going to be in. And almost all school psychology programs, including yours here, has some sort of program related to where does your field fit into the general growth and development of the field of education. And that's big. I think more recently, what's it going to mean if Elon Musk and all the gang in Washington shuts down the Department of Education? What's going to become of the state departments of education and their role in accreditation and their role in training and in credentialing? These things could all change, and they might not change for the better. So that the two worlds analysis, I think, is particularly important in the field of school psychology, and it
And
affects all sorts of things. Yes.
I'm sorry if I can interrupt. You have questions coming in. I don't know if you want them now or if you want to wait a little bit.
Oh, let's take one. We'll go see what we got.
Yeah, so someone asked, my question is going to be about the role of school psychology in the development of IDEA. I had an awesome conversation about the school psychologists who were sitting at the table during the development of PL 94-142 with Jean Ramage. I remember her talking to me about how many school psychologists who influenced these laws. I'm wondering what Dr. Fagan remembers about this or what he knows about this.
IDEA was a major energetic booster shot in the arm for school psychology. Prior to IDEA, or what they used to call EHAC, back in when it came out in 1994-142 and 1974, 75 in that era. NASP had maybe 5,000 members. Within 5 years after IDEA was initiated, we had about 20,000 members, because there were clauses in the Exceptional Child Acts at that time that suggested that school districts had to have school psychological services, not necessarily school psychologists, but psychological services available. As time went on, that term kind of changed more toward school psychology, but NASP and Division 16 of APA were heavily involved in that. And I think they got caught off guard when IDEA was first enacted in 1974. They weren't really at the table so much as they were after that. It was a message to school psychology and probably a number of other groups that everything's moved to Washington now. You better get the hell out of your hometown and get up there and figure out how to write legislation and get it done. That was one of the reasons why NASP was founded, because there was no legislative representation of school psychology in DC, or for psychology much at all, for that matter. So they did that, and they've been very proactive. That's where that term kind of comes from, as opposed to reactive in the world of education. But There weren't enough school psychologists to go around, and I suspect that it would be several years before many rural areas in the country had access to a school psychologist. That's probably true today, even that there are some areas that have a school psychologist that's available to them, but not necessarily a full-time employee of the district. Other questions or?
Tom, you wanted us to remind you of the VIP box.
The VIP box. You know, one of the things I like about school psychology is that it's filled with little bitty stories, many of which should never be told. And I'll take them to my grave about how this president thought about that president or whatever. But yes, the VIP box. This is the VIP box. I've had this in my possession since, well, it was first given, I believe, to President Mike Schrin, who was NASP president in the early 70s. And it was when we were having our convention in Las Vegas, probably at Caesar's Palace. By the way, I shared a room with Paul Warden from Oklahoma State. Our room at Caesar's Palace was $22 a night, $11 a piece. It was pretty good. And dinner and show with I'm trying to remember who was the entertainer at that time, but it was $25 dinner and the show. It isn't going to happen anymore down there. But at any rate, one of the things that these hotels would do is they'd put a VIP box in the president's room. It was just one of the little freebies that came with being president, that and limousines and whatever else you needed. And in the VIP box are 2 bottles of booze. One of them is a Crown Royal whiskey from Seagram's, and the other is a Thousand Piper Scotch. And you'll notice that there's some drinking going on these. And I finally gave it to my son last year, and he likes to nip on that. And so we keep it around. Gene remembers. Gene, what do you remember about Carl DiMartino and when he died?
Well, I remember that Carl unfortunately died while he was president of NASP. And so after that, for a number of years, there would be a group of us who knew Carl and knew him well, who met at NASP and would have a shot of his Maker's Mark. That was his favorite liquor.
So we'd have a little round table hoist, and everybody would
In
get.
memory of Carl, yes.
I think Carl was the first president to die in office.
I believe so.
I think so. Many of them have passed, but Jean Ramage is still active in the field of school psychology in California, and she was her name was Lepaluoto in those days. So when you go back and looking, her maiden name was Jean Lepaluoto, and she married somebody, and I think that's how it got to be Ramage. And I'm not sure, but I think she's married to a rock drummer or something. I know she has her own nursery or antique store somewhere in California, but I think she married to a band leader of one sort. So the VIP box was kind of there. A connected story would be at the 1972 convention, I think. And I believe that that was set up by John Austin and the fellow from Arizona. And they always want to entertain people. So when they came to Las Vegas to look for a convention site, I remember Mike Schrin telling me, you know, they went over to the president of NASP and they suggested to him, you know, that we've got great suites and all that. And if you need any women, you know, we can take care of that too. And they didn't know this guy was a minister. He just died about a year or so ago. He was 90 or something. But yeah, we aim to please, whatever. And it was a great convention. Probably had, I don't know, it was probably one of the first conventions that NASP had where they exceeded 1,000 or 2,000 people that was there. But yeah, that was pretty good. We had, I can remember many of us from Illinois at that time had gotten an airplane and flew from one place to another, I think Denver to Peoria, Illinois, to DC for a convention. And on the chartered flight, they had all kinds of little booze bottles of all types that were in the back of the plane. And when the plane landed in DC, they told people just take whatever you want, put it in your pockets, and go on your way and enjoy it. And so people had little bottles of all kinds of things going on. But that was a pretty raucous flight, and that was a good time. Lots of little good historical stories, I think, about some of these conventions too. But the NASP convention for me today is so much different. When I used to go to the NASP convention, probably up until the 1980s, late 80s, I knew damn near everybody there. I had met them at their state association meetings or whatever. Now you go and there might be 6,000 or 7,000 people there, and they're all recent graduates and whatever, and it's not as familiar to me as it would be. So that's changed a great deal, I think, over the years.
Yeah, Sarah has a very interesting story about introducing some of our Nova Southeastern students to you at one of the events
I've
in
probably a
Wisconsin.
picture of that somewhere I might have.
No, there was a student who, it was their first time at the NASP convention. And we were walking back from one of, I can't even remember what city it was, but they were very far distances. You had to walk from one place to the next. And I asked her, "Oh, have you met many people here?" And, she said, "Oh, yes, I've seen everybody, but the only person I haven't seen is Dr. Tom Fagan." And so we happened to find you as we were walking in, I think in the bar area. And
It was the bar area,
What was he
yes.
doing over there?
I don't know, but she almost started crying. She was so nervous.
Did
And so
we take,
excited to have met you.
we
So
might have taken a
yeah,
picture at the time. I don't know. I might have it
and I
somewhere.
will have to check.
It's
One
probably in there.
question, yeah, but it meant so much to her.
I
And
have a lot of photos, hundreds of photos of board meetings and people from those days, but I
yeah,
haven't ever had the time, and I better do it soon, to go back through and label who all these people are, because the next generation won't have a clue.
for sure. And I know before we started the event today, you were showing us like so much historical information and tests and, just so much that I don't think many of us have had the honor of seeing. So I want to make sure you're able to do that. But I also want to ask you what you envision, like at this point, having seen so much history. One of the questions that came in, given all the changes going on right now, what would you predict will happen with school psychology?
Professional psychology, including school psychology, is really, to me, in a fairly stable period of time. Not too many, other than DEI, which is all over the place, and artificial intelligence. Um, School psychologists have been doing what they've been doing for about 120 years in some places, and my sense is with that much history behind them, that the field will likely stay a lot like it is now. I don't think it's getting a whole lot bigger. It must be pushing 35 or 40,000, and that may be about the peak of which they could expect to get to. I don't see the test publishers stopping revisions and that. They seem to know where their bread is buttered, and that the area of assessment, which has carried school psychology for a long, long time, since the beginning days of the Binet and whatever. There was a time when the Binet was so popular that the State Department of Education said that probably every child that's coming into the field of schools should be given the Binet and their educational life determined for all time, right then and there. People really thought the Binet was the end all and the be all, and that people were giving, they even, I don't know if I don't have a copy of the slide rule, but they had a slide rule where you could score maybe one of Binet in a matter of minutes, and that very quickly. But the Binet was very, very popular. One article in the 1930s celebrating, I think, the 20th anniversary of the Binet suggested that it's so popular that it changed Binet's name from a noun to a verb, because everybody knows what it's like to Binet a kid. And that and yeah, so I have, this is what the original Binet had the doll in it, named the body parts, whatever. And of course, later people would say, "Oh, let's get a little bit more sensitive," and they would have a girl doll And then I think it went to, they had a doll that people could consider was androgynous. You couldn't figure out if you wanted to what it was. There was a guy up in South Dakota that wrote a great little poem about it, but I won't quote that now. I don't have a copy of it with me, but it sort of ended with, we know one thing about the new doll in the Benet, it's not Sven or Oli. The original Benet was down, was connected to the research area in psychology, and they were looking at things coming out of labs and applying them. And this is the just noticeable differences test that used to be used to see how sensitive your hand was, and being able to judge the weights of this and put them from the lightest to the heaviest. Not easy to do. You had to know how to score it. And there's somewhere on each little block, there's a mark that tells you how much weight is in that particular cube. But the little cubes probably sold for $1 or $2 by the Stalting Corporation that makes the lighter. They started making something like psychology equipment. Charles Stalting was an engineer and made all kinds of equipment for psychology labs and that. I have a catalog of them somewhere. The protocols were quite similar. You had little puzzles. So this is what the 1916 Benet looks like. And Sarah says she has one of these around somewhere. This probably is not what it came in. I've never seen a 1916 Benet with a specific case for it. I happen to have a bunch of 37s, and this is a 37 crate for that. But everything's in here, the manual, the picture cards and that, some of them even from that particular era of time. That box up there has a lot of little parts in it that you have to deal with. And there were subtests for making change, and you had to have a certain amount of money. You had to carry more money than the kit cost. This kit probably, with manual and all, you could get for under $20, I'm sure. The first kit that I got was this one from a fellow named Stanley Marzal, who had a copy of the Henry Goddard version in 1915. And the manual cost, it's pretty fragile, but you can see it here. At the bottom, the manual costs 15 cents. That's what it costs for a Benet. Today, you couldn't get a protocol sheet for 15 cents today. But it had a lot of the tests that would survive and go into the 1937 Benet. And I'm trying to see that it would be like one of these would be like that. You had to pick the parts that are missing on this particular woman. And they probably still have that picture completion idea in some of the tests. This was a favorite of Benet's, and I showed this to the group a little earlier. You wouldn't get past the door to the schoolhouse if you asked the child to name which one's the prettiest, and you got to get 2 out of 3 right. So later they got more sensitive to what's going on in the world, and they put some men in there, but that didn't last long either. So you won't find that aesthetic comparison test around anywhere anymore. But this, I have another kit here, and this is what it looks like. A 1937 Benet, Form L and Form M. 2 forms were developed from the best subtests and additional subtests in the 1916 version. The L was for Lewis Terman, the M was for Maud Merrill. And the parts to these are absolutely amazing. You can see down there in the lower left-hand corner, I think it is, there's a little black stove. You see that?
Mm-hmm.
The little doors on that actually open and close.
Wow.
The flag thing that was in there, the scissors was a real scissors. The ball was rubber, probably hard as a rock by now. Almost everything was made of wood or metal because the plastics era in test kits had not come about quite yet. But it was very, very important. And of course, the formation of the Wechsler series of tests was particularly important. I'd say the Binet owned the land of intelligence testing from its early 1916 viewing up through probably into the 1950s. So, and then the Wechsler scales came out, and you had this particular WISC of 1949, and the manual and all, I would guess for probably, I don't know, I was trained on this in the 1960s. You could get the whole kit for about $35, and it came with even some protocols in that. It has all the puzzles. It has the picture completions. It has all the block designs and that stuff in it in the back. The arithmetic tests, the block design. So a lot of that carried on from the Wechsler Bellevue before that, developed by David Wechsler when he was at the Bellevue Hospital in the 1940s. And in fact, he had served as intern supervisor for Rosa Hagan, who was a very famous woman in the field of school psychology and ended her career at Fordham in the downtown campus, I believe, at the time. So it has had a tremendous similarity with block designs. Trying to see what color these particular blocks are, because not all of them were just red and white. These were red and white, but they also had blues and yellows and others on them that you would have to match the design. And then the puzzles, all the picture puzzles and the parts for the puzzles. You could see that was the automobile puzzle and that. It was always amazed me when I was an intern that some kids could tell you what it was, but couldn't put it together. You know, they just didn't have the whole gestalt of the thing, I guess. But the Wechsler scales just took off. And what really made them take off is that the Binets were getting outdated. The age tests and the age of the child weren't lined up as well as they used to be. They might be 2 years off. There were special tables for changing the values for it to be more accurate, they thought. But the concept of a deviation intelligence quotient, I think, is what really took off for the Wechsler scales, where your performance against the average for your age group determined your ability. So if you wanted to get smarter than you used to be, you better pony up and get more items right, or you're going to slide behind, or you'll stay basically the same. But the concept of an IQ with a average score of 100 and a standard deviation of 15 compared to 16 with the Binet really carried that, I think carried it very well. And then you began to see that go into the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale in 1955. And then the WIPSI, and then all the revisions. So it just seemed to go on and on and on. I can remember going through some old test materials and coming across tests that were used at Ellis Island. And one of these appeared in the Cornell Cox Performance Ability Scale in 1934. Cox was at the State Department of Education in New York, and Ethel Cornell was the chief psychologist. And this was the earlier version of the face picture that would appear in the waist later on. And you can see the similarities and little differences in the puzzle pieces, but very clearly an attempt to do that. Another item would have been, well, we had the aesthetic comparisons item that you see there. And the Wechsler scale just sort of did it all, I think, for a long, long time. And they probably still have a really large share of the intellectual assessment market, even though you have the DOS and the other kinds of tests out there today. You didn't have that kind of selection possibilities. It was the Binet or nothing until the Wechsler scales started coming out. This was kind of interesting. I came across this in a brochure from the Cleveland Public Schools. And these psychological services summaries from 1918 through 1928. And you think about changes in special ed and different kinds of things there. If you look at the areas and the number of evaluations and the frequency of certain diagnoses, the diagnoses are written in the box. You can see over time how much the services had changed more and more to the higher income, higher intellectual kind of people over in here compared to the earlier days of the clinic they had, being more involved with serious cases. But the categories that are listed are called bright, normal, slow, dull, moron, imbecile, and idiot. Those were the categories that they were being identified by for special education services, with IQs attached to those, and those different things every 10 or 15 points or so. So a lot of similarity, a lot of interesting things that go about it in the field. Any other question?
Yeah, Dr.
Yeah, there-
Fagan, we have a question in the chat box. So one of the participants is asking, one of my favorite things to teach is the seminal conferences of our profession, Spring Hill Olympia Conference, Thayer Conference. At the Olympia Conference, the notes indicated there was a mock Senate hearing. I'm wondering if Tom remembers this and or if he has any fond memories of the seminal conferences that we should know.
What was that person's remembrance of the Olympia conference?
Olympia is that they had a mock Senate hearing.
Oh, yeah, I'm trying to think what it was, if it was for special education or if it was about licensing or something there, but yes. You can get the proceedings of that conference, the Spring Hill proceedings of 1980 and the Olympia proceedings in 1981 appear in full issues of the NASP Journal back at that time. And those are still available. I would turn people to there to see what all they said about the Senate conference, but I believe people were asked in the audience to come up and testify for or against the testing aspect of school psychology and that, which has never really gone away. By the way, this is a copy, they cost about $5 at the time, of the Thayer Conference proceedings, published by the American Psychological Association, and this was in 1955 for the 1954 conference. I always was amazed at the 54 conference because when you go through and you read all this and you go to the back, they list everybody that attended. It wasn't like there were 1,000 or anything, there were like 50 or 60 people that attended. And where they worked and where they came from and that sort of thing. And you got to know a lot of these people. Somewhere here in my items. So. Yeah. (1954) was significant for the Brown versus the Board of Education decision. And that was made, I think, in May of 1954. And this conference came out in August. It was about a 9-day conference, so they had plenty of time to cover a lot of things. When you take the proceedings and read them cover to cover, you'll never find the word Negro, African American, or any culturally sensitive minority group mentioned in here. That just wasn't on the radar. You wouldn't find it in APA either. But school psychology just simply hadn't got to that level quite yet. More recent concepts, of course, would be more prevalent. Where were the school psychologists at that time? This was a listing of all the people for that conference, roughly, in 1953. And you can see that, in fact, the field at that time, mid-century, was pretty much dominated by the Northeast, spreading into the Midwest, as far as Illinois and that, and then jumps to the West Coast. Florida had a good representation in those days as well. There weren't many state associations, there weren't many training programs. That's what the Thayer Conference was all about, trying to get a toehold on the professional development that still really needed to be done in the field of school psychology if they were going to get to where they really wanted to be. This is a picture of somebody sent me from somewhere, probably an archive. It's not in the proceedings. It's all the people that attended the Thayer Conference. The importance to me in this is that if you get close with a magnifying glass, you'll find several minorities in here, and you'll find that the whole front row are females. And that would be rare in psychology history in those days. And I have a picture of the Boulder Conference from 1948, I think it is, and it's not near as representative, I don't think, as the school psychology one was. Again, it's part of the two worlds of school psychology. Where did most school psychologists come from in those days? And a lot of them still do. They come from teaching fields or guidance fields, and they had been with public school experience. In some areas, you couldn't become a school psychology member of an association unless you were working in a school job. No trainers, no student members. You had to be a practitioner working one-on-one with kids. Other question?
Yeah, we have one question from our own Dr. Scott Poland, who was asking about the history of school psychology and crisis intervention.
I don't think you'll find the term crisis intervention very much in the history of school psychology and its publications, and that much before Scott and others got so active in the field in the latter part of the 20th century. For some reason, you just didn't have the kind of troubles in the schools. Not that they were, very clean, but there are cases I've read about where the children, usually adolescents in schools in the 1800s, would beat up their teacher and kill them. In fact, one theorist said that one of the reasons that the teaching profession became so feminine is that people hired women because they didn't think these young thugs would beat to death a female principal or teacher. Well, they were wrong, but nevertheless, I don't think there's a whole lot about crisis intervention prior to the schools really getting heavily involved in mental health and crisis intervention. And today, I would have thought this shooting them up in the schools would have blown over by now, like other things sometimes do. But Scott, it certainly doesn't seem to, does it? And I think Scott's work, along with that of a few other people, really put school psychology on the map as a potential mental health professional in the schools that you're not going to get on the map for with the Binet or the Wechsler scales. So that was very unfortunate that it's come to the schools like that, but many school psychologists today are getting crisis intervention. The training programs have that in it. You won't find any courses regarding crisis intervention in the old training programs prior to probably the 1970s, 1980s. They just wasn't there. It's like consultation. The consultation role of school psychology, it goes back to Whitmer. He was doing consultations, but you won't find that as a major school psychology activity until you get into the interest in the 1980s in particular of consultation and the many books on consultation, training programs requiring a course on consultation, and many of the training programs have crisis intervention now too. For many decades in the training of school psychologists, you basically took an experimental psychology graduate program, and if you were lucky and lived in the right district, you'd throw in a practicum maybe on a local mental health center or at Wexler Bellevue Hospital and that sort of thing. But no, it's not a lot there. I'm not sure exactly
So Dr.
why.
Fagan, in your training in 1960s, did you have practicum classes and internship, and what courses were your favorite courses? It's kind of interesting to hear what your training was.
Favorite courses?
Yeah.
When I was in graduate school, you took one course on the Binet and you took another course on the Wechsler, and you had practicum probably running part of the way along there. But the credentialing in the state of Ohio at that time, and this would have been in the mid to late 60s, was a 30-hour master's degree or a 36-hour master's degree with a internship in Ohio, which was really unusual. And the reason they got that historically was because the State Department of Education required you to have a year of teaching and a teaching credential. Well, who the hell wants a school psychologist that hasn't had background inside of school psychology that came out of teaching and that? And so they bargained that off with the State Department of Education in the 1960s and got rid of the requirement for a teaching certificate specifically and experience. They still wanted education background in there in that training though. And you got the internship as your fieldwork experience in education. And those kinds of trade-offs were not unusual. Up until recently, I think Alabama still required a teaching certificate, but I don't think they do anymore, or they found a way around it. But a lot of places got the internship as a bargaining chip for something else along the line. Did that answer your question, Arena?
Absolutely, yeah. Thank
It's
you.
you know, even I know when I wrote an article once called "Training School Psychologists Before they were training school psychologists, before they were training programs." And you would find that as an interesting article. How did people who claimed to be Gazelle, the first school psychologist by title, or Leitner Whitmer and that, and other people that got into school psychology, how the hell did they get into it? What did it take? Well, if you dig around on some of these campuses and get to their archive, you'll find that their transcripts are still there. And I could figure out what courses they took. They wouldn't tell me what grades they had, but they would tell me what courses they specifically took. And it was not unusual for most people trained in something like school or clinical psychology up through the 1950s to have basically a master's degree in experimental psychology and statistics and research design, a course somewhere along the way in intellectual assessment, and possibly a practicum if you could find a school district willing to take an intern in that. So yeah, it's the training thing really shifts. And the reason for that is that Division 16 puts training standards on the table in the 1960s. And then, of course, the whole world turned doctoral for them, so those changed. And if you have that little chart that I had sent around, I don't want you to leave without a basic few words about it. Everything on the bottom over here is the period of history for most all of professional psychology, but I have a chart like this for every area of professional psych, counseling psych, school psych, IO, you name it. They're very similar, but you'll notice in the middle here, it says developmental divide. And to me, the two worlds of school psychology really comes about in this chart as well. Everything on the early end of the chart is basically unregulated. And so I always used to ask students in the essay test, tell me about the importance of the developmental divide and the period from 1945 to 1955 in professional psychology. In that 10-year period, finally, you got a code of ethics in APA. APA was been around for 50 or 60 years. They didn't have a code of ethics. You finally get a code of ethics around 1953. You begin to get training programs, training standards. You get accreditation starting right after the Boulder Conference. It's not as though APA was nuts about this kind of development. The professional experimental war between people in APA had gone on for decades. And a lot of people wanted to maintain. I would say that one of the outcomes of the Thayer Conference and the Boulder Conference was a decision to keep the field running and to make some concessions on things so that it would still be looking like a experimental degree at some point, and that you would throw an internship in with that as well, and maybe the ABEP, the American Board of School Psychology. These things all come about to the right half of the chart when it says things are formal, have rapid development, official status, and enforceable efforts. And on the left side is informal, slowly developing, unofficial status, and unenforceable efforts. So you'll see all the journals that get started down in here in the books, and look at that. The arrows, if the bottom of the arrow sort of indicates when that particular activity started, and then where it goes to as it pretty much ended. And you'll see that things like licensing, certification, and that, APA level type doctoral licensing in most states didn't really get off the ground until 1945, 46, 47, probably in Connecticut. And by about 1975, all the states have licensing of one sort or another at the doctoral level. Prior to that time, many states did not have much at all. School psychology was the earliest credentials because they were in the other world of school psychology, the education world. They required certification and regulation of all the teachers, and many people thought a school psychology certificate wasn't anything more than a teaching certificate. We still have some of those blunders around, but nevertheless, their line goes back to about 1935 in Pennsylvania and New York. Both of them had credentialing for school psychologists, which meant they had to have training programs, program visits, and that. And you begin to see the whole world becoming much more formal. All the journals that are forming, the big books that are being written are over on this chart. So this chart you can use as a developmental movement of the field of school psychology that pretty much goes from kids in school with trouble. Somebody's got to help them. Who we got? Well, we got this here, but it's not that good, but we'll do it. And then you begin to get people saying, well, if we've got that many people that want to do it, let's have some sort of training standards. You get training expectations. You then get training programs. You then get accreditation of programs. And it goes on to getting more and more formal all the way. I would have never guessed when NASP started that it would come to a point where you could actually get a certificate as a supervisor and not just a school psychologist, and that you would have the national certification separate from the membership of the group and have all the expectations for it and what have you. In my more obnoxious moments, I would tell someone in the national leadership, one of the reasons there's a shortage of school psychologists is because you damn near ran us out of business. You know, you have so many rules and regulations at the state level between one thing and another thing, and then dealing that with NASP as well. But when I was in graduate school, the expectation wasn't for an internship, it was a practicum. When I came here in 76, they still were requiring just one semester practicum in a school setting. You hoped if you could get in there. But the training just literally flipped in the next 10 to 15 years. So that before long, you needed to have a master's degree. Let's make it a big master's degree. Let's make it one with 60 or 70 or 80 hours. And people start saying, well, why the hell don't you give them a doctorate? Well, we'd like to, but you see, the doctorate's owned by the big university down there, and they don't want any competing programs around the state. So you get a PsyD and you get a other kind of program running that does what it does and is much more practitioner oriented. By the way, the PsyD degree in clinical psychology was recommended as early as 1915 or 16 by people that thought there's really ought to be a professional degree, just like the EDD is a professional degree in the field of education. If people want to do research, go get your PhD and have a good time. But we need to have a more practitioner orientation. So today, once the PsyD degree began to catch on in clinical, it was just a matter of time before there were more people coming out of PsyD programs than all the PhD programs put together. So it just changed a whole lot of things in a relatively short period of time. But prior to the developmental divide, you had no training programs, no credentials, or they developed during that first 50 years, no credentials, no code of ethics, no organization specifically for school psychology. APA didn't have a division for school psych till 1945. There weren't any other groups that had it. Well, prior to that, you had an educational and a clinical division in the old American Association of Applied Psychologists in the 1930s, which quickly rolled over into APA. And then they got a division, and somebody at the last minute said, let's have one for school psychologists too, and not just educational psychology. Okay, 15, you're ed psych, 16, you're school psych, 12, you're clinical, 14, you're IO, 17, you're counseling. Everybody got a little piece of the pie and made whatever deals they had to keep APA running bigger and bigger than ever. You didn't have training standards. You didn't have a school psychology literature of much identification. you didn't have any accreditation, and you didn't have legislation that specifically talked about school psychology. So that developmental divide, to me, is the critical period when school psychology finally went into both worlds and succeeded. APA for years couldn't deal with the non-doctoral issue, and that now they're trying to control it. But for decades, they couldn't manage it, and you could tell them flat to their face, go look at NASP. They've done this. They know how to make people feel good and do good work with a less than a PhD degree or something like that. So a lot of places that couldn't get a PhD got a PsyD, and you're seeing a much bigger improvement. When I came into school psychology with NASP, about 3% of the whole field had a doctorate in anything. And then probably about 15 different titles. By now, you've got 27, 28% of the field has a doctoral degree. I once erroneously predicted that by this point, 2010, that the field would be doctoral and be happy about it. That isn't going to happen. They got happy about being non-doctoral, and they were making just as much money or more. The training programs were more accessible. They were never going to solve a practitioner shortage by dealing with doctoral students only, unless you wanted to give them at Sears, at some department store where you could go buy one because they were the only outlet in the community. So it's the developmental divide is particularly important. If you take the Thayer Conference proceedings, get a copy out of the library, you'll find some around. That is about as good a snapshot as you're going to get of what school psychology looked like in the 1940s and 1950s. It's an amazing growth in the field of professional psychology. And I am a bit worried about the future of school psychology and how much organizational membership people will continue. I can remember the excitement of people getting up in the morning and I'm going to be a school psychologist today, and I'm going to the NASP convention, and I'm going to run for office and that. Half the offices probably for NASP delegate assembly and that don't have anybody running against them. We used to require that you couldn't be in the election unless it was a contested election. But a lot of them now, I think they're just happy that somebody agreed to serve. Probably at the state level too. We have people at the state level that have been president 3 or 4 times. They can't find anybody else that wants to do it. We need more professional involvement. So if the students out there are interested in getting into it, get into it. It's a solid field. It's a safe field. You're never going to lose your job. I don't care what Elon Musk says. We still don't have enough school psychologists, and it's going to be just fine. You'll get a good salary. Try and find another non-doctoral psychology field, other than maybe IO, but that would pay you as well as a school psychologist do. School psychology salaries now are probably averaging 65 to 70,000 bucks coming out of a master's degree program, and that's only for 9 months. Prorate that on 12, and you're into some pretty heavy money. So it's a good field. I'd say it's a very solid field. But yeah, people come to me and they say, what should I look at in graduate school? Why don't you look into school psychology? Really? Never heard of it. It's not in my intro book. Doesn't talk much about it at all. I know. But there's a program down the hall here. Go talk to those people about it. They got jobs. They got benefits. They have retirement programs. They got all kinds of things that the other fields really can't afford to have or are unlikely to get. But they get them because they're on the education side of the two worlds of education that requires organizations and licensing and all kinds of other kinds of things. Other concerns?
Yes, there was a question. It says, Dr. Fagan, you've classified the history of school psychology in terms of the hybrid years and the thoroughbred years.
Yes.
We're still in the thoroughbred years, or would you classify this current period?
The hybrid years, I would say on this chart, would be before the developmental divide and sort of after that. The hybrid years, for me at least, really ends around the founding of NASP, and then everything becomes very formal and very thoroughly, as I would talk in the book, it would say, that's when you finally went from this to a field where the faculty were actually school psychology. There were credentials in school psychology. How many of the first few generations of school psychologists were trained by non-school psychologists? You know, the Gil Trackmans, The other people that were very important in the field, they came out of clinical programs. That was all that was really available. So now you have a very thoroughbred kind of field that's not tainted, if you will, by so many other kinds of things invading into it. It's us, and it's worked. It's a very strong field. The notion now, after 60 or 70 years of accreditation, the notion that NASP is finally going to accredit its own damn programs lets you know how thick the politics are there. And it took that much time to get the accreditors in the field of education comfortable with doing programmatic as well as institutional accreditation. And maybe the school psychologist could do this just as well. It would be probably very expensive, I would think. It wasn't the first time we had considered doing that. Back in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of talk about NASP getting into accreditation, and the analyses of that by outside groups was that, well, if you got $100,000 you don't have any need for, you might be able to get a toehold into the accreditation world. But don't think the deans of education that control most of these programs are going to be nuts about having to have another visiting team, because they pay a lot of money every year for these visiting teams and accreditation. So yeah, that's an area that people in NASP that really worked that field for a long time have done very, very well with. As people were touting for years, let's accredit our own damn programs instead of having other people come in and do that.
Sure. There's another question that says, thank you so much for all of the historical information about testing in school psychology. We are wondering what Dr. Fagan remembers about the collaboration between school psychologists and behavior analysts during the 1960s and 70s that produced effective interventions and the field's focus on MTSS implementation.
Most school psychologists spent 80 to 100% of their time doing individual psychological evaluations. There were always a few rebels out there that did behavior plans for children full-time and didn't do a lot of testing. One of our presidents, Fred Dornbach, who's still alive, lives up in the Chicago area. He did nothing but behavior plans back in the 1970s. When FBAs and those kinds of things were getting popular. They got so popular and seemed to be sufficiently effective that now you'd have to get a credentialed behavior analyst to work in your school district, because your school psychologist can't get involved with that by that title. They could call themselves a school psychologist, but couldn't call themselves a behavior functional analysis specialist or that, because they took that over and they credentialed it in a lot of places, probably as an area of education or an area of special education. But that's an area that surprised me, that many school psychologists got in on that. RTI has probably helped that quite a bit too. You go to some places like Illinois, you have to have an RTI analysis, I think, for every area of exceptionality you evaluate. So that's kind of different. But I'd say that the behavior analysis area of school psychology was taking off in the 70s when Skinner and other people were doing behavior analysis and schedules of reinforcement and a lot of that kind of stuff that really waned for some reason. It either it didn't work long enough, it was too difficult or something. But if you go back to the Spring Hill or Olympia conference, you'll see an article in there. Forget the author's name, but it was one of the big authors in behavior analysis who said, think it over again, because it's not going to work. It's not working. It's not being accepted. And that's a seminal kind of article about the structure of education, and that it just wasn't going to catch on. Maybe it wasn't quick enough, whatever. Maybe it involved too much invasion into what's going on in the classroom to begin with, to have somebody doing these things. But there were a lot of really good special educational programs and behavior analysis programs, I think, back in those days, but they just seemed to wane out into consultation. Nevertheless, most training programs today probably have a behavior analysis course in it. On our campus, We don't have a course in it. We have a major in it at the graduate level, and you can become a behavior analyst as sort of a minor field in your doctorate in school psychology. Just the way it's played out.
We have another question about the relationship between NASP and APA and your thoughts on how that relationship evolved and
Well, when NASP got formed, APA initially their board met, and felt that this was going to be a blip on the screen. They weren't going to last long, and then they'd come begging, almost in those terms, back to Division 16 to accept them again. It was sort of like the problems between the two different golf tours in America, if you're familiar with the PGA and the LIV tournament. Growing up and how much money is involved in that, and how are they ever going to come together? Do I think APA and NASP will ever merge? No. Some people always thought that would be the ideal, because then you'd be among the largest divisions in the APA. But now NASP did it right, and they liked it, and there wasn't any way they were going to become associated as a PhD only, EDD only field. I thought at one time maybe enough people would get doctoral degrees in something that it would tip in the favor of the doctoral role, and that they would merge with APA. But even today, APA is Division 16. I'll bet doesn't have 2,500 members. And it's been like that for about 40 years that they've had pretty good, they owned the landscape till the founding of NASP, and then they've had to work with NASP on a number of things. They do work together quite well. They worked on the Spring Hill and the Olympia conference. They have a lot to offer each other. I never, when people say, well, that damn APA, they're always in the way of this. I have to remind them, where do you think those standards came from? Where do you think the American Board of School Psychology got started? These are all back in the 40s and 50s. Division 16 was very active in doing that. They just lacked a state association structure that could very quickly disseminate information and policies and that sort of thing. And NASP had, at that time when they started, 17 state associations. Now they've probably got 50. And if they want something to change, they get people's ideas at a delegate assembly, which is geographically based, not by votes of different people and different specialties. And it made a big difference. And they're able to say, when the Olympia conference was over, or other futures conferences were over, NASP could go to their delegate assembly and say, okay, here's the new message, spread it out down there. And they had people going back into every state to do that, no matter how rural or whatever. And by the late 1970s, early 80s, every state, including Alaska, Hawaii, and whatever, had school psychology representation. Division 16 didn't have that. They weren't organized around state associations or state credentialing and that sort of thing. So that's an important different thing between the two worlds of school psychology. Nevertheless, I think the two have gotten along quite well over many years. As contentious as it's probably been in the past 20 years is only when the issue of what's the licensing, yeah. And if you read I'm convinced of this, tell me if I'm wrong on this, but I think that the latest agreement they made on the Model Licensing Act was where NASP agreed to give up on the title outside the schools, unless the state happens to have it. I don't think NASP promotes non-doctoral private practice full-time for school psychologists.
No, they haven't for a long time.
I think those sentences were changed around a little bit. They certainly own the titles and all of that in the schools. And if you have certain states allow for non-doctoral practice with additional training or that, but they expect it to be minimally specialist level training, internship, and all of that. So I thought they had kind of conceded an area that used to be one that they didn't concede at all. Their standards in NASP, their standards used to say that the specialist degree was an acceptable entry level for school psychology in the private sector or the public schools. And I think they changed some of that. It was
Yes, they
never,
did as a compromise with APA.
yeah, and it was never a big deal anyway. You know, you could look in the mirror and say, well, who in the hell is in the private practice? Look at the NASP surveys every 5 years. Who's in full-time private practice? Probably less than 1% of the whole membership is in it. By the way, one of the things about the NASP membership that's continued to bother me over the past 20 years is it's getting increasingly representative of students. They've got thousands of students in a field that purports to have 35,000 practitioners. Where the hell are they? What do they get student status, pay their dues a few years and get out? You know, something's not there. The holding power is not there. Same with minorities in NASP. The holding power has always been difficult there. I was amazed when in the second presidency that I had, I'd go to the District of Columbia Association meeting or the New York or the Chicago meeting. The place looked like an international hotel. You know, it was all people of color, people of cultures, of all sorts of things. But I didn't see them in the NASP membership so much. And I can remember people telling me, even Deb Crockett when she was president and the others there, it's like, we can't get them to stay. It's too hard. They just, it's a lack of trust or something, but they don't have the same sense of belonging to associations that groups do. And I think that's spread more and more and more, and it affects their leadership.
Yeah, not only in school psychology, but in
Yeah.
lots of other professional fields. The connection with with associations is weakening.
You know, the real first tip became so many females in the field of psychology. And APA was pretty worried about that back in the 80s. And I think they had a study on it that showed, you know, they wanted to know, where the hell have all the men gone? Not like they died out here, but they've gotten out of psychology. Clinical psychology has become, you know, our program is probably 95% female. All the programs are that way. Among the doctoral programs in experimental psychology, our hardcore neuropsych people up on the 4th floor of our building, it's almost all women. You know, it's just the nature of the program changing over time. And I think APA concluded that the men all went into the MBAs and into the casinos or something, but they're not in psychology like they used to be. And that.
So there is a question
I
that
used to
sort of
joke.
taps into what we're discussing is, given your historical perspective, what are the next steps for the profession of school psychology to take to continue to break down the evident barriers that continue today that lead to a lack of diversity within the field? And as a follow-up, who are some of the historical figures that have helped to promote a more diverse profession?
Yeah. I wonder now how many training programs in school psychology are rethinking their admission statement to make sure that it's minimally divisive. You know, that the DEI word is going to be tough. So, but I think NASP has done very, very well at that. The percentage of NASP membership that has rolled into minority areas in that has been really substantial, but not big, but maybe 2 or 3 times what it used to be 30, 40, 50 years ago. But there were always significant African-American psychologists, school psychologists out there. Cornell Lane from Tennessee was active in NASP from day one. He's probably retired now. Clifford Graves at the Cleveland Public Schools is one. There are articles out about Albert Sidney Beckham being the first African-American school psychologist. You know, it's there. It's just not as prominent as you'd think it would be given population figures. And it's not as though NASP hasn't tried or Division 16 hasn't tried. They've tried a lot with scholarships, whatever. It's just a tough area. And in fact, I think we're kind of in an era where most people don't want to belong to too many things. And belonging to the local association, the state association, the national association, and APA and all of this run you a couple $1,000 a year. So, yeah.
Right.
There's room to grow there. I suspect they'll continue to do that. I'd like to see an article, I've not seen one yet, of what became of all the minority scholarship winners over the past 20 or 30 years.
A great idea. Yeah.
Where'd that money go? Did it go into people that became practitioners, or did they just change their mind about what they wanted to do as they went along or whatever? But that data is there. Somebody's got that data.
Yeah. And I think broadly, you know, school psychology has struggled deeply with the shortage of practitioners and of faculty members. And it's really of the three specialty areas, school psych has always been the smallest area. And for whatever reason, there are barriers broadly to people going
Yeah,
into school psych doc programs or specialist programs.
yeah.
So
Well, and you know, it takes a long time to become a school psychologist. This isn't the NFL where you can be a walk-on, you know, and all of a sudden you're a walk-on and you've got great talent and you're on the team, and you're making $50 million. It's not like that in school
after a
psychology.
while.
You have to have an undergraduate, 4 years at least of an undergraduate degree, a graduate degree in a field and a place where it's available. And then you find your way into employment. And by the time that's done, you've been working at it for 10 years or so.
But it's interesting because clinical psych, for whatever reason, and I think it starts at the undergraduate level, there's a tendency for people to not understand that there are three areas, and that all of them at the doctoral level will lead to licensure. So there are still biases, I think, broadly around school psychology that, you know, kind of puts up a barrier to people considering that when they're applying for doctoral training.
Well, people used to tell me, you know, one of the troubles with that is the school psychology is messy. It's a messy field.
They're
What do you
kids,
mean?
they're always
But
messy.
you have to deal with children for one thing. They'll drool all over your test materials. It's a messy field, and you have to deal with parents, and those parents aren't always very happy. Who would be? They've got kids with troubles, and you're the bearer of bad news, and those kinds of things. And that it's too messy compared to just sitting in my office at home, conducting a private practice, and working it that way. So it is. You've got to get down in the dirt with school psychology.
So someone's asking who you think is the coolest historical person that you remember meeting and that is no longer with us.
Uh, Probably Gil Trackman would be among those people.
So Gene can speak to that because he was trained by him.
He was an outspoken person, lived a pretty good life. He and his wife, she was a clinical psychologist. He was trained in clinical, probably at NYU. Like others, Erwin Hyman and some others that were in the New York to Philadelphia tunnel for school psychology back there, probably couldn't get into a graduate program in experimental or in clinical, and that's why they went into school psych. Their articles tell about that. But yeah, it's Gil certainly would be there. My own advisor, Don Wonderly, was a very important person in the field of Ohio and in my own training in that. People always got a lot of good vibes from their mentors. I think their training mentors as significant people. But yeah, that's big time there. And there were people in state departments of education and others, but a lot of that had to come together from several different angles to keep the field as strong as it is. And it is a strong field. I still think it's got maybe not a whole lot of room to grow, but a lot of people are going to turn over in the next 5 or 10 years that came into the field in the 1970s instead of the 50s and 60s. So we're probably coming toward the next third wave or fourth wave of people, and we'll see if there's sufficient numbers being trained. There never have been a time when there were enough school psychologists.
Yeah.
Back even in the Great Depression of the 20s, they were short on school psychologists. They were hiring people to come in with bachelor's degrees or whatever, just to do evaluations in the schools so that they'd have somebody there in the major cities. But now school psychology is American psychology's man in Havana. You know, they're the ones down there in the trenches in every school district of the country. So you got, I don't know, 13, 14,000 school districts. They need psychological services.
For sure, for sure. It'll be interesting to see, particularly with APA and the Masters in Health Service Psychology, if school psychology can have a greater presence because there's that push towards master's training. So,
Yeah, I think until school psychology merges NASP into APA, where it would have a great deal more power in that, but it'd be non-doctoral power. There's probably still a lot of people not nuts about accrediting non-doctoral programs.
yeah, yeah.
And that'll be an important step there, and a busy and expensive step for APA. But back in 1970, 71, when school psychology finally got APA to allow them to APA to accredit training programs, 3 of the first programs they were going to look at were non-docs. And at the last minute, they said, nope, we're not going to do it. They didn't make the visit and backed out of that. But that would have been a significant moment right then and there. But I'm sure it was people in the other areas of professional psychology that said that's going to be inconsistent with the licensing standards that we have and the training standards we have, and I don't think we should get into it. And they didn't. They chose not to.
Well, Irina and Jean, do you have any other final questions for Dr. Fagan? We went well over the time that you gave us, but we couldn't stop you. Do you all have any?
I
Just
think we
wanted
can
to-
keep going, but we have to be respectful of
If
people's
you go
time.
to
I would
one-
love
if
to
you-
hear more.
I think if you go to your library on campus, you might find a copy of Psychological Service for School Problems by Gertrude Hildreth, written in 1930. It's probably the first real book on school psychology, and it describes what a school psychologist typically does in a day, and the relationship to psychology and education. Gertrude was, I would say, arguably the first school psychologist in the state of Oklahoma, and her materials that she left in that school district when she worked there included with ETS. She developed a lot of achievement tests, but interesting letters between her and her parents, and information about the school district in a little town called Okmulgee, Oklahoma, which is south of Tulsa somewhere.
Wow.
Not a very big area, a small area, but
And you-
she was there for a
Hildreth's
year or
book.
two. Then she
Yeah,
went to New York, got a doctorate at Columbia. Everybody seemed to have went through Columbia at one time or another. But it's been a
Hildreth's
pleasure to
book.
be here, and we might do it again sometime.
Yeah, and there are
Thanks,
lots of
Tom.
people who are giving you, saying beautiful things in the chat box. And I don't know if you've had a chance to see them, but people are thanking you so much for your time, for giving us, a glimpse into your family. Hi.
Here's my wife, Susan.
Hi, Susan.
Hi, Susan.
We stole him for an extra half hour, so thank you.
Yeah.
Too bad the children aren't here, but one of them has a girlfriend in Taiwan, so he's over there.
Wow.
The other one, she's a clinical psychologist. I couldn't get her into school
Oh my
psych.
gosh.
She's,
Okay.
she's in Kansas City, full-time private practice, pretty much operates out of her office or home. And Lance works for a business company that's pretty much New York based, I think, but he and his wife live in Atlanta. She works for Coca-Cola, so
Oh,
you
wow.
can't go wrong with Coca-Cola.
No wrong, not at all.
Yeah.
Well, we want to
Well,
thank you so much that, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at lots of messages in the chat box, but everybody is thanking you for your time, for your expertise, for, just sharing with us a little bit about all the treasures that you have and your extensive knowledge.
well, I'd be glad to do it again and go through a few more of the treasures in the pile here, but
Yeah, I know. It looks like you're
Great.
surrounded by them. It's beautiful.
I'm trying to think, what version of the Wexlers are they on now? Are they on Waste 4, Waste 5?
Waste 5.
Used to be a test lasted about 30 years.
Not anymore.
Now you're lucky if you get 10. And they're
Exactly.
very expensive.
They are.
Oh,
And
yeah, yeah.
Zenful
Test development is the reason for that.
Yeah.
And we could
Thank you.
talk about the test kits going through the pizza box era of the 1960s and 70s to the vinyl case era.
Wow.
And now it looks like fancy luggage.
Right.
I think half the
Right.
price of the test is the luggage.
The luggage, yes.
Well, and if you wanted a nice array of intellectual assessment, you'd need a van to carry all the kits because there's
Right.
a ton of them out there.
Yeah. A lot
So,
of it's online now.
well, you people have a nice weekend, nice day. Enjoy yourself.
Thanks,
And
Tom.